Hello, we are here again. Welcome back to another week of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. I am your host, William Gibson, and today's guest is Kat Whitehouse. Welcome, Kat. Good to have you here.
Good to be here. Thanks.
Kat is the Faith in Action project worker for the Student Christian Movement. Her work is shaped by a deep interest in how faith and politics meet in our everyday life and how this shapes the way we build community, support both our neighbours and those we disagree with, and work for justice. The focus of Kat's year at SCM is on loving our neighbour and enemy, and they have run workshops with students on the rise of the far right and how it conflicts with Christian faith, as well as on LGBTQ plus rights in the face of hate, titled Love Over Fear. As a queer Christian, Kat is particularly passionate about LGBTQ plus inclusion in faith spaces and creating environments where people feel safe to be fully themselves. Some of her highlights in the role so far have been the Ace and Faith panel, which she hosted in collaboration with Ace Space London and organising the SCM Virtual Candlelit Vigil for Trans Day of Remembrance 2025. Joining us from the JPIT team today is Alex Clare Young, JPIT's Campaigns and Church Engagement Officer. Welcome, Alex. Good to have you here. Let's just set some of the context with headlines. The House of Lords has backed a social media ban for under 16s in the UK. Trump has cancelled tariff threats and agreed a future deal over Greenland. The Davos World Economic Forum is taking place, including plans for the Gaza Board of Peace, and deadly landslides have occurred in New Zealand. So, Kat, let's start with a question that we love to ask on every episode. Does politics belong in the pulpit?
Yes, emphatically yes. I don't think anyone here or SCM would say no or disagree. And I think it's a key part of like my job to link theology with activism and put faith in action. And I come from a politics background, and I think the church, especially the progressive church, should be an outward source of good in the world after years of like hurt and mistreatment of those in the margins. And for me, politics is more than just Westminster. And I think I said that in my interview. It's about daily lives of people, and it's unavoidable. Like we can't keep out of church. Definitely yes. In short.
Yes. It's great. I was going to say Micah 6 verses 1 to 8. One of our first readings for the lectionary is definitely a Methodist rallying cry. So I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on that. But in terms of the lectionary readings for the Sunday, the 1st of February, we have Micah chapter 6 verses 1 to 8, Psalm 15, 1 Corinthians 1 verses 18 to 31, and Matthew chapter 5 verses 1 to 12. In terms of awareness days, we have LGBTQ plus History Month for February. So we keep all of these things in mind, the news headlines that we've talked about, and the awareness days as well, and we can get into the conversation. But first of all, Kat, were there any passages that you would pick to preach from, or a theme across the lectionary text that you saw before we get into the details of these passages?
If I was preaching, I'd probably focus on the Micah reading, the Beatitudes in Matthew, and probably a bit of the Psalm, because I feel that it seems like social justice coming together. So yeah, so that's what I would focus on.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. So let's start with Micah then. What did you take from this passage?
So the end of the reading, verse 8, immediately jumped out. So that's the verse that says, "And what does the Lord require of you? Act justly and love and to love mercy, for what can be with your God." But yeah, due to my background, like this verse is really familiar with me. I've always paired it. Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, all the ways that you can, at all the times you can, all the people you can, as long as ever you can. And I was actually reflecting on this for some work with SEM recently. With everything that's going on in the world, um, it's more important than ever. For so long, the church looks inwards. We should be looking at our communities. I think Bonhoeffer did this a lot back in the 40s when um, he would speak out against far right nationalism. He didn't want to just banish the rooms of victims. He wanted to drive his spoken of injustice itself. And I think we can think that those days are long behind us, but we look at the headlines, we look at the rise of the far right in the UK. We look at like things happening in Gaza, we look at just conflict throughout the world. So we look at those groups who don't have the same rights as other people. I think we should really be trying to make the world better.
Yeah, I think it's a really powerful passage, and I like the way you linked it to Bonhoeffer's quote there about not just bandaging wounds, but actually driving a spoke into the wheel of injustice. But for some of the context around this passage, in this passage in verses 1 to 8, we find ourselves in the midst of a heavenly courtroom with God, the prophet Micah, and a spokesperson for the community of ancient Israel making their case about the situation that they find themselves in. The context of the book of Micah is as one of the minor prophets, and the context can be found in 2 Kings chapter 16 to 19, which focuses on the rule of the kings Ahaz, Jotham, and Hezekiah. And what we see in Micah is a prophet condemning the corruption of the rulers in Jerusalem and of the high places that are regularly mentioned in 2 Kings. These were sites of idolatry and sometimes of child sacrifice, which is why we see in verses 6 and 7 the questions from the representative of the community asking God, what sort of sacrifice is required? And that very famous answer that you mentioned there, Kat, in verse 8 is the response that God gives, which is, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love mercy, and walk humbly with God? So for me, in this passage, it speaks clearly to the situations that we find ourselves in today. The high places of our day may not be worshipping the Assyrian gods, as in Micah's time, but the gods like Mammon, money, and Mars, war. And they have a loyal following. So when the questions come, would the Lord be pleased with the billions of dollars of stocks and shares as Mammon would be? Or would Mars be satisfied with over 20,000 children murdered in Gaza? The prophet speaks to our day what is required but to do justice, to love mercy, and walk humbly with God. Alex, what did you take from this passage?
Yeah, so I think I absolutely agree with all of that. And I think the Bonhoeffer quote is really similar to the way in which we think about our constituency action network. So we use the story of the Good Samaritan and say, well, there's that kind of one Good Samaritan bandaging wounds on the road, but what about further up the road? Thinking also about MLK's Junior's quote about needing to go up the road and find out what's going on and why people are kind of getting hurt. So it's not just about fixing the problem when it emerges, it's about actually why is the problem emerging. And I think this speaks really powerfully to that. I was thinking about some verses just a bit higher up before we get to the famous do justice, love kindness, walk humbly. And what I was thinking about was God's question, oh, my people, what have I done to you? Because to me, I think that does two quite interesting things. One thing that it does is it kind of posits this conversation about injustice in a relationship. We often find it easier to hate our enemies or to like be really angry at all of the aggressors in the world at the moment. And I think that's valid. And I don't want to tone police that at all. I think we're at a time where everything's exceptionally difficult in global and national politics, and where there's a lot of anger. But actually, this reading makes it really clear that it's a loving relationship with God that calls or should call the leaders of a country to action. So there's something there for me about the kind of that it's a response to love. It's not just do justice for the sake of it, it's do justice because actually love is important. Relationship and the quality of our relationships with each other are important. But the second thing that I think it does is it makes us think about how we treat other people in line with how we treat God, because God's saying, what have I done to you? So it's like by acting unjustly, ancient Israel in this reading are offending God. It's not about offending other people. It actually offends God when we're unjust. And I think for me, that's really important in the context of talking about politics, because often people will say from a Christian perspective things like, well, human rights don't really matter. We should be thinking about God's law. And I think Micah makes it really clear that God's law is about treating human beings well. It is about human dignity, and it wounds God when we're unjust. And that's why God's kind of saying, but what have I done to you? So it kind of reminds us to see God in other people and in the way that we treat them. And I think that's all the more powerful because this is talking about ancient Israel and kind of unpicks some of the threads of Zionism by talking about the kind of being liberated from the land of Egypt and what that means. It gives us a different lens to that.
Yeah, I think there's potentially also something about marginalization and relationship to power within the context of Micah, because Micah's from a small town southwest of Jerusalem, and I'll probably butcher the pronunciation of this here, but it's Morashethgath. And in many ways, he's preaching a populist message against the aggressive superpower Assyria and the corrupt leaders found in the centers of power in Jerusalem. And so Micah's rural background puts him at the margins in ancient Israel and shapes his understanding of who the Messiah would be. Because if we go back to chapter 5, this Messiah will not come at the center of power in Jerusalem, but a little town called Bethlehem, which is similar to his own hometown. And it made me think, Kat, of what you were saying about politics not just being limited to Westminster, but being in the daily lives of people and what we do there. So when you think about the context of Micah in that way, do you have any other thoughts in relation to that?
I think it's, if in a way, it kind of validates kind of what I was thinking anyway, because it's kind of thinking that sometimes it feels like a new thing. It's not people are speaking out and kind of people speak out for the people that were oppressed and speaking truth to power. I think it's kind of, yeah, it kind of validates the fact that we should be doing it still, like thousands of many years later. Um, and I think I was going to make a link with what you guys were saying directly to LGBTQ History Month, which obviously you mentioned at the start of the episode is this month. Um, and I think for much of society that they still feel that they're in the margins, even with all these years of progress. And I think the call to do justice for me today looks like working for the community that has so long felt othered and ostracized. And having a month is great, 12 days is great, but the struggles are real and they're hard and victories are hard to get. And I think it's important to talk about this in all areas of society, and not just this month, but every day, which is what I do. But yeah, I think looking at who the oppressed people on the margins are today and using this message to help them, because if we're all created and loved by God, then therefore we should all be subject to the same, love and freedoms, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that relates really nicely to our next reading, which is Psalm 15, which opens with the line, "Who may abide in your tent? Who may dwell on your holy hill? Who's welcome in the church? Who's not?" That's the sort of initial thoughts that came to mind for me. But what are your thoughts in relation to that, Kat?
So I don't think I'd actually read this psalm before today, well, before preparing for this podcast. So I'm grateful for the opportunity for more of the Bible. But I did some reading around it, and I found that it was an entrance liturgy. So I was reading that it's kind of they're asking kind of what, like, Lord, what do we have to do to get in, to be loved, Lord, to be allowed in, your holy place. And as I did some reading around it, I found some commentary which invited us to look. I think the psalmist says this as well, but like to not look at it as a set of requirements to get in the door, but as guidance for how we should live our lives and act away from the sanctuary. Because let's be honest, most people aren't at church 24/7. You're out in your daily lives at work, school, clubs, seeing people. That you're there much more than you are at church. A quote that I've taken from this commentary is the concern of the psalm itself is not what happens when one is inside the sanctuary, but what happens when one is back in the world on the outside. So are we loving our neighbours? Are we standing up for the poor rather than exploiting them? Are we speaking out and standing up for the oppressed? And again, with my role as faith and action project worker, that kind of marries perfectly with what I do. And this person said, why don't we think about an exit strategy to accompany the entrance liturgy? So go in peace and serve the Lord, go in peace and love your neighbour, go in peace and give back to your community, go in peace and strive for justice. It's kind of like that's enough to get us in, but it's not, it shouldn't stop once we're inside, if that makes sense. So.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And I think there's another question about what is genuine worship here of like people coming into the temple, and it's these expectations of this is the sort of characteristics of what genuine worship looks like. And we see 10 different actions being described in the psalm, and the ones that stood out for me were doing what is right, speaking truth, not slandering others, and avoiding economic exploitation. And the theme that seems to come out with a lot of that is integrity, staying true to our values even when it's difficult. Verse 2 talks about speaking truth from the heart, and verse 4 talks about standing by our promises even if it hurts. Alex, what were your thoughts about this, Sam?
I think that it's really important for all of the reasons that you both have stated, and particularly in terms of economic justice and to some extent in terms of political justice, where we potentially see promises being broken. So, for example, there's a lot of conversation around family reunion of refugees at the moment that may end up with government kind of breaking a promise or going back on a fair way of treating people. And there'll be a campaign coming out very soon after this is released around that. So keep your eyes open for that. But I think it's also quite a challenging reading because it's setting justice in the context of, and you're not going to get in if you don't do it.
Yeah.
And I think to some of us today, that can be quite off-putting. So I do think it's really difficult, but there's a need to somewhat kind of relativize or flip this in light of the gospel to say, you know, actually, these ways of thinking about what it means to live well are still really important. But we do them because we're allowed in, not to be allowed in, if that makes sense. We
Yeah.
are called to action because God loves us. God doesn't love us because we act. Um, and that kind of frees us up a little bit actually to just try even harder at these things. Um, because it's not that, you know, there's going to be some um, cosmic punishment or banishment from church if we don't act justly enough, but actually it's because God is so just that why wouldn't we want to be?
Yeah. Kat, were you going to say something in response to that there? Or-
No, I was going to say it's really powerful because it's kind of all about living it truthfully and authentically, and not just doing it for selfish gain. So I think that's really really important.
Yeah, definitely. So, on to our New Testament readings then. So, the first one we'll be looking at is First Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 to 31. And First Corinthians 1 is some of the passages that we've been looking at the last couple of weeks. We've been considering the first two sections of Paul's letter to the Corinthians, and we're now finally reaching the climax of the first chapter. So we've had his greeting to the church so far, Paul's acknowledgement of the divisions in the church, and now we hear Paul's message or opening message to the church at Corinth. The message about the cross that is foolishness to the world, God's foolishness being wiser than human wisdom, and God's strength being stronger than human strength. So you can go back and listen to our previous episodes for some additional context on this chapter. But Kat, what did you pull out from this reading?
I pulled up bits about God's standards and kind of the meaning of power and who's viewed as powerful. And I kind of thought about the world of politics and how the world is kind of geared towards, it's probably reductive, but strongman politics. Strength in the world is seen as for gain, and like, I don't think God judges the same way as humans do or choose the same people. So you look in politics right now. You've got like Trump in America, and there's this Greenland peace, supposed peace, but at what cost is this peace? You look at Russia, you look at Israel. It's kind of image focused. It's personal power. Whereas I think God chooses those who, the world doesn't view them as strong. He came to Earth in human form as a baby. He picked, God picked David to fight Goliath. I think he values more than what the world sees. And I was thinking more about like activists in the world, and I was thinking about like Greta Thunberg and Malala, and I was thinking like they were seen as weak children without voice, but yet the effect they've had on the world and politics is insane. And I guess it links to like the prosperity gospel and like, oh, why does someone have something? Oh, it's because they're good. But actually, I don't know. It really made me think about how we view power and how we view strength, and whether it's biblical, I guess.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that this passage brings out that the passages we've looked at the last couple of weeks in First Corinthians haven't is actually it gives us a description of who makes up the Corinthian church. So verses 26 to 28 tells us that not many of you were powerful, not many of noble birth, and yet God has chosen you to put to shame the wise and powerful through the proclamation of the foolishness of the cross. So we see here once again God's preferential option for the poor, choosing the poor, the weak, and the marginalized to demonstrate the power of the gospel. So this seems to me to be a celebration of God's inclusive kingdom that transforms our understanding of social relations and power. Alex, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I really love the way that this is kind of almost a tables turning reading. This is about power in its conventional sense being turned on its head. I absolutely love the song, The Canticle of the Turning, which is based on Mary's Magnificat, but like definitely goes with this reading as well, and that sense of wisdom becoming foolish and foolishness becoming wise in how we think about it. For me, in terms of Japet's work, it made me think a lot about the importance of listening to lived experience, and particularly the lived experience of those who aren't thought of as having normative wisdom, so who are marginalized or oppressed in whatever way, and really kind of seeing that wisdom as wise and not judging it in relation to conventional wisdom, which is often what happens. It's easy to listen to lived experience and take on board some of it, but reject other bits of it because it seems counter to conventional wisdom. But actually, we need to recognize that conventional wisdom isn't always wise.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant reflection, Alex, and that flipping of the script on wisdom relates really nicely to the flipping of the script on what it means to be blessed in our next reading with Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 to 12, and the Beatitudes. So, Kat, this is a well-known passage. What did you pull out of this one?
So with what you just said right now, I started off with the whole looking at the word beatitude and, as you said, meaning to be blessed. So who is Jesus saying that's blessed in this passage? I picked out lines like "Blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those who are persecuted, for those is the kingdom of heaven." So in this passage, Jesus is describing who the kingdom of heaven is for, who is blessed, who is sent for, not marginal, even if society tells us otherwise. And I think it fits in with the key teaching of Jesus of love, compassion, feeding the poor, standing up against injustice. And I think it's echoed in the sermon from the Sermon on the Mount, which is part of. And I think I would, if I was doing a sermon or a speech or preach on this, whatever, I think I'd approach it two ways. So when preparing for this, I found a speech by Nadia Bolz-Weber, and I think her work is really kind of transformative. But she reflects on the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes. And she offers up the idea of what if we view, so at the moment it's kind of like we view the blessed are as like a command for us to try really, really hard and be better at various things and be more blessed in the eyes of God. But what if it's more of like an inclusive message of this is who it's for, if that makes sense? We're not a this is what you should do, but more of a I'm here to bless everybody, I'm here to love everybody. And it's quite a lavish blessing. I think it does catch joy in those who might feel excluded. She wrote the new blessings to a hurting world, and I think I really relate to those, like building on Beatitudes, so kind of not replacing them. So some of the lines in that are: "Blessed are those who no one notices, blessed are the forgotten, blessed are those who doubt, blessed are those who feel they have nothing to offer, blessed are the bullies and the weak, blessed is everyone who has forgiven me, when I didn't deserve it." It really kind of builds on the idea I spoke about just now, and it ends with "You are of heaven, and Jesus blesses you." And I think that's what Jesus came for and what it's all about. He's for everybody, no matter who you are, where you are. And as I reflected on LGBT History Month, as I reflected on scenes in Gaza, I don't know how the headlines have shifted since we recorded this, but I believe that everyone is, loved by God, and my progressive politics feeds into that. I think for many, we forget, or many in the church might forget, God isn't just for the ones who are in the building. Blessed are those who are outside suffering. And I think especially now for like queer people, trans people, I think we need to spread this message for far and wide. I could probably get in a soapbox and preach on this for hours, but there you go.
Yeah, I don't know if either of you can comment on this, but there was a video I saw a couple of weeks ago. I think it was the Department of Justice in the US who took the "Blessed are the peacemakers" line and released a video with, I think it was like an Apache helicopter, and then afterwards some tanks, and used a very masculine line of for they will be called sons of God. And yeah, did either of you see that?
No, but I need to look into it after this.
Oh, it's terrible. Yeah, a terrible interpretation of that passage, using "Blessed are the peacemakers" as part of US military propaganda. Definitely one way to not read this passage this Sunday. So, yeah, as we've already said, this passage is the beginning of Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount, the well known Beatitudes. There's some debate among scholars about what Matthew, as a gospel writer, is trying to do here with the Beatitudes, because Luke's version has four Beatitudes compared to Matthew's nine, and Luke's are much more focused on kind of this worldly concerns. Because of this, it's led some scholars to have different interpretations. On one end, we have those who say that these are an idealized vision of ethics that are so impossible to live out that they serve to highlight the grace of God, the inadequacy of humanity. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have those who see these as a sort of manifesto for the early Christian community. But for me, when I was reading this, I tend to side with the pastor and theologian that we've already mentioned today, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. In his reflections on the Beatitudes in his book Discipleship, he upholds the call to discipleship and to follow Jesus at any cost. For Bonhoeffer, this meant living out the Beatitudes even in the face of fascism and Nazism. He wrote that the only hope for the world was the church of Jesus being the body of Jesus on behalf of the downtrodden. For Bonhoeffer, the Beatitudes make sense only when we look at Jesus on the cross. And the way that Jesus describes the world in the Beatitudes is not the way the world is right now. We can all see that. The poor are not blessed, they are trampled on. Those who seek justice are not blessed, they're disappointed. The persecuted are not blessed, they're killed. So, in this kind of world, how can words like the Beatitudes be true? And this is exactly what Bonhoeffer asks as well. Here at the end of the Beatitudes, the question arises as to where in this world such a faith community actually finds its place. It has become clear that there's only one place for them, namely the place where the poorest, the most tempted, the meekest of all may be found at the cross. And so for me, this ties together quite neatly with the passage from First Corinthians. This is a gospel that stands in contrast to conventional wisdom and rule by force, but is a gospel that we are called to live out here and now. Alex, what did you take from this, from the Beatitudes?
Complete agreement with Bonhoeffer, and kind of bringing the reading before us, the Corinthians reading that we were speaking about, together with this. I think in both of them, we should be asking ourselves as local church congregations, where do we sit? Who are we? Because often churches are tempted to think of themselves as marginalized. And I think the Beatitudes really challenges that and says, actually, are you actually marginalized? What's actually going on? As you said, William, those who are marginalized are being killed. Are we being killed for being Christians in the UK? No. So, it forces us to think about the power that we do have, and actually some of the normativity that we hold, and some of the ways in which we keep people captive by not sitting with the poor and oppressed and marginalized. And that's why I actually find the gospel that uses the version of the Beatitudes that has the woes afterwards is actually also really powerful, because that speaks about woe to those who have power, and it challenges us to recognize that we want to be sitting on the side of the poor and marginalized, and using that power that we have in solidarity. I also like rewritten versions of Beatitudes, using the Beatitudes as a point to jump off of. I did that once with a group of young people, none of whom thought of themselves as particularly blessed. And the reasons they thought they weren't blessed is because they'd been told by churches that they weren't blessed. So using the Beatitudes as a tool to actually rethink that, and with this being LGBT History Month, I think it might be a core time for folks to be able to do that. And if folks would like to find another Beatitudes remix, as well as Nadia Bolz-Weber's one, which Kat mentioned, which is really good, and I would strongly suggest looking it up. And I think we'll be able to put the link for that in the chat, because it is available freely on her blog, so that can go in the description of this episode. There's also one on In Flesh Liturgy, which is an American collective who create liturgy together. And they have a Beatitudes remix as well. And, earlier I was talking a bit about tone policing and the difficulties around how we speak about injustice when things are so difficult. And the Enfleshed Beatitudes remix starts with the words, "Blessed are you who are raging. Blessed are you who are raging." And it ends with the words, "Blessed are we when we dare to imagine repair. Blessed are we when we labor to make it so." And so it kind of points to a different way to use rage as something that's about birthing new things, which I find really powerful.
Yeah, definitely. So as we're beginning to come to the end of the episode, Kat, do you have any closing thoughts on these passages taken as a whole, or some of them paired together?
I think for me, like, so I instinctively paired the Micah one and the Beatitudes one, and I think it's, I guess, there's so many of us who are already like going out to seek justice, the SCM, JPIT, there's so other many organisations, and it's great. But I think it really does emphasize the call to action and how, like Alex was just saying, like, we need to be, rage is good, but what do we do with that rage? Yeah, just kind of using our faith as a backbone to do good in the world. And I think if more people did that, the world would be a better place.
Yeah. Alex, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. These passages are really active. It's quite hard to justify inaction from out of these passages, even though as a minister or pastor, I often want to say it's okay if you feel overwhelmed, you can't. But actually, these passages are really pointing to action. And I'd say from a JPIT perspective, if you're feeling that and thinking, but what can we do? Get in touch with us, because there are lots of really easy things that we can do to act. And we need to, like, now more than ever.
Well, thank you, Kat, and thank you, Alex, for joining us today. It's been wonderful chatting with you both about these really deep and really rich passages when it comes to the themes of justice and politics in the pulpit. And thank you to all of you for listening. I hope this episode helps you in your preaching preparation. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcast and share this episode with your friends. We also have online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on our social media platforms. And as we close today, we might be wondering what God requires of us as we face the reality of our world. The prophet Micah cries out to us across the centuries, telling us clearly, do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with God. The psalmist reminds us that this journey with God is part of our worship, and that genuine worship requires of us integrity, speaking truth and doing what is right. Paul tells us that God has chosen the weak and foolish things of this world to demonstrate the power of the gospel, which is seen most clearly on the cross. With this perspective, we can, with Bonhoeffer, read the Beatitudes and see not an idealized utopia, but rather a radical call to follow in the way of Jesus, because even in the midst of mourning and persecution, in our unsatisfied hunger and thirst for justice, and in our work for peace in a world of war, it is in those places that we are blessed. So as Jesus reminds us, rejoice and be glad. Have a good one.